that. Good morning to you all. Glad you're here this morning. Appreciate your presence. If you're visiting with us, we're certainly thankful that you're here. You're an encouragement to us. We want to be an encouragement to you. If you have any questions for us, we'd be glad to answer those questions. We encourage you to come back and be with us anytime that you can. Let me specifically say I'm thankful for my brethren here at Gardendale. I was mowing my yard yesterday, and I was just thinking about something Jeff May told me several years ago about when he was working here. He said, Mr. Clayton Barnes got up one night and gave a lesson called The Good Church Gardendale. And he talked about some of the good things that the church of Gardendale meant to him. And I was reflecting on that yesterday in regard to myself. And I think me and Mr. Clayton have never talked about that lesson, but I think we'd probably say some of the same things about the good church at Gardendale. There's not a day that goes by that myself and my family do not thank God for the good church at Gardendale. Thank you all for who you are to me and who you are before the Lord. It's a great encouragement, and we love you. Open your Bibles with me, please, to Exodus chapter 14. Exodus chapter 14. I've been on somewhat of a theme of leadership. I did a sermon on elders and a sermon on deacons. A couple of weeks ago, I did a sermon on men just being who they need to be as men. And I'd like to continue that theme and kind of round that out today and just talk about becoming a good leader and use the example of Moses. When you think about leaders in the Bible, Moses has to come into the discussion, doesn't he? Moses was a great leader before God. But that doesn't mean that Moses was a perfect man. Moses made his own mistakes. Moses had to be shaped and molded by God to become the leader that he was. And in the same way, I think we can take his example and make the application to ourselves today. That good leaders must be shaped, must be molded, must be before God what they need to be as leaders through a process that comes about. First of all, them having the desire to lead, but then becoming molded into the leader that they need to be. And I think we can see that as we look to his example. Let's study those things today. And let's take these examples that we can pull from Moses' life and leadership and use them to apply to our own today in a very general sense. First of all, what I think we can see in the life of Moses when it comes to being a good leader is that there are characteristics of good leadership. And we see that in the man himself. When it comes to good leadership, the first thing that I like for us to see is that good leadership has absolute faith in God and His will. Once Moses has been convinced of the fact that he needs to be the leader that God's called him to be, he's been convinced of the fact through the signs, wonders, and miracles that God has done before him that God is who He says He is and that God is going to do exactly what He says He's going to do. Moses then becomes that leader before Israel who exemplifies this very thing. Absolute faith and trust in God. You remember all the plagues done before Pharaoh in Egypt. God says through Moses, let my people go. Pharaoh hardens his heart. Every time he doesn't let them go. Finally, last plague, death of the firstborn. After which Pharaoh lets the people go. But God tells Moses, I'll harden Pharaoh's heart again. And Pharaoh's heart becomes hard. And he sends out 600 of his finest chariots after those people leave Egypt. They get to the Red Sea, and now they're caught between the Red Sea and Pharaoh's chariots and Pharaoh's army. And what do the people begin to do? They begin to complain and murmur. Exodus chapter 14 brings us to that point. And let's begin reading in verse 10. And when Pharaoh drew near, the children of Israel lifted their eyes, and behold, the Egyptians marched after them. So they were very afraid. And the children of Israel cried out to the Lord. Then they said to Moses, because there were no graves in Egypt, have you taken us away to die in the wilderness? Why have you so dealt with us to bring us up out of Egypt? Is this not the word that we told you in Egypt, saying, let us alone, that we may serve the Egyptians? For it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than we would die in the wilderness. And Moses said to the people, do not be afraid. Stand still and see the salvation of the Lord, which He will accomplish for you today. For the Egyptians whom you see today you shall not see again no more forever. The Lord will fight for you, and you shall hold your peace. The whole congregation of Israel is scared to death. And they start saying, Moses, why in the world did you bring us out here just to be slain right here? You should have left us in Egypt like we said before we ever got out of there. And one man, it seems, the leader of the people, stands up and says, now you stand still and see the salvation of the Lord. What does he mean in that term, stand still? Does he mean you just stand there and do nothing? No, he says you stand steadfast in your trust and your dependence upon the God whom you serve, the God who's brought you to this place, because that's what Moses was exemplifying, isn't he? You just watch what God's going to do. You trust in what He's already said and what He's already promised, and God is going to fight for you, and God is going to preserve you. And God did, didn't He? And God showed up in a powerful way, and He overtook the Egyptians, each and every one of them. And He proved His point that He is the God of all creation. Hear Him is what Moses could say there. Stand still and see the salvation of the Lord. That's what good leaders do. When it doesn't seem reasonable to do so, they stand in their place and they trust in God and they point people to the will of God. Do you think any Israelite on that day would have thought it'd be reasonable for them to be standing by the Red Sea? There's got to be a better way. It wasn't reasonable in their minds, but reasonable or not, faith, true faith in God, caused Moses to point them to what God had already spoken. True leaders, that's what they do. The second thing you see as a characteristic of good leadership is that good leadership brings people together in unity of purpose. Chapter 18 of the book of Exodus. We find now they move further from the Red Sea, and they travel to a point to where Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, hears of the success of Moses as a leader. And he comes out just to observe the whole thing, to meet Moses and the congregation of the people. Well, there comes a time at verse 13 when Moses sits in his judgment seat, if you will, and all the people come before him, and Moses is to rightly decide the judgments among the people. And Jethro says to him, son, what are you doing? You are going to wear yourself out. All of these people, and you sit here all day long having to make these decisions. There's got to be a better way. And Jethro gives him advice on how he should handle this situation. Let's pick up at verse 17. So Moses' father-in-law said to him, the thing that you do is not good. Both you and these people who are with you will surely wear yourselves out. For this thing is too much for you. You are not able to perform it by yourself. Listen to my voice. I will give you counsel, and God will be with you. Stand before God for the people so that you may bring the difficulties to God, and you shall teach them the statutes and the laws and show them the way in which they must walk and work they must do. Moreover, you shall select from all the people able men, such as fear God, men of truth, hating covetousness, and place such over them to be rulers of thousands, rulers of hundreds, rulers of fifties, and rulers of tens, and let them judge the people at all times. Then it will be that every great matter they shall bring to you, but every small matter they judge themselves. So it will be easy for you, for they will bear the burden with you. Well, the reading goes on to say that Moses did just as Jethro advised. Moses came to understand something that was very important for him to see, that I can't do this all by myself. Yes, I am God's appointed leader. I have been chosen to lead this people, but I can't do this all by myself. I need help. And Jethro says, look out from among you, and you choose men who have certain characteristics, certain men who trust in God, who obey His will, who have these attributes of character already within them. And you use those men, put them to work in the service of the Lord, and let them help you. Two things at least are accomplished there. Number one, you give some men who have ability a job to do and further develop themselves so that they can become a leader just like you are. Number two, what do? You're giving them some significance of something that they're a part of. Now they don't feel like they're being lorded over. They feel like they're an important part of a work that they're doing for the Lord, and they're making it more effective. And at the same time, they're making that work much more efficient because they're all working together with a unity of purpose. That's what good leaders do. They bring other people together to help do the work. Also, we see in Moses that good leadership is level-headed in times of crisis. Go with me to Numbers chapter 21. Numbers chapter 21. There was a time further down the road as Israel is wandering, that they came to the land of Edom, and they asked the king of Edom to let them pass through, and he said he would not. They were going to have to go around. Well, in that period of time, Moses' brother Aaron dies. I'm sure that was a tragic loss for the people. Also in that period of time, the Canaanites fought against them, and I'm sure it was a tough battle. The Lord gave them the victory of the day, but you can imagine that they already have been denied easy access of travel. Their high priest is dead. And now they fought a tough battle, I'm sure. But now they come to a point they're going to have to go around the land of Edom, and it wasn't an easy trip. And the context of chapter 21 shows us that very clearly. Begin with me in chapter 4. Verse 4 of chapter 21. I'll get these things right eventually. Then they journeyed from Mount Hor by the way of the Red Sea to go around the land of Edom. And the soul of the people became very discouraged on the way. And the people spoke against God and against Moses. Why have you brought us up out of Egypt to die in the wilderness? For there is no food and no water, and our soul loathes this worthless bread. So the Lord sent fiery serpents among the people, and they bit the people, and many of the people of Israel died. I want you to think, that's the same argument, the same murmuring that's already been going on time and time and time again. Is God fed up with it? He's fed up with it. And there's a more specific statement that's made within the murmuring here. Our soul loathes this worthless bread. What bread was that? That was the manna being sent from heaven. God is feeding you with heavenly food and you loathe it. How disrespectful is that? Even at the very least, how disrespectful is that? And God's fed up with it. He didn't warn them at this time. He didn't say a word. He just sent fiery serpents in their midst. They bit the people and many of the people died. Can you imagine that scene? When it means fiery serpents, he's talking about poisonous snakes here. That's what he's talking about. There's poisonous snakes running around all the camp of Israel and biting people. Verse 7. People got the hint, didn't they? Therefore the people came to Moses and said, we have sinned, for we have spoken against the Lord and against you. Pray to the Lord that he may take away the serpents from us. So Moses prayed for the people. Then the Lord said to Moses, make a fiery serpent and set it on a pole, and it shall be that everyone who is bitten, when he looks at it, shall live. So Moses made a bronze serpent and put it on a pole, and so it was, if a serpent had bitten anyone, when he looked at the bronze serpent, he lived. I mean, just think about putting yourself as Moses in that situation. You're the leader of this belligerent, disrespectful, complaining people. And God's fed up with them, and He's sent snakes in the midst of them, and they're biting them, and people are dying all over the place. That's a chaotic scene, isn't it? You're the leader of this people. Couldn't you see Moses running around to and fro, screaming, wondering what in the world he's going to do? But that's not what we see at all. We see Moses, from what I read here, cool, calm, and level-headed. What does he do? He listens to what God says to him. Moses, here's what I need you to do. I need you to make a bronze serpent and put it on a pole. I don't know about you, but I think that took a little time, didn't it? You've got people running around being chased by snakes, and Moses is sitting over in the corner building a bronze serpent. You don't think that's level-headed? What did Moses stand as? Moses, being calm in the time of crisis as a leader, stood as one where people could see a place of comfort, a place of hope, and a place of salvation. They could look to Moses and see the will of God and know there was a place that they could go for safety and security. That's what good leaders do. They point people to God. They point people to that place of comfort, hope, safety, and security, just as Moses did here in the wilderness. All of these things apply to us, don't they? There may be a time when we as Christians have questions asked to us, just as Israel's asking Moses on the bank of the Red Sea. Questions about this not being reasonable at all. People do that to us. Well, what do you mean that I have to be baptized, immersed in water for the forgiveness of my sins? That doesn't sound reasonable at all. Why can't I just ask Jesus to come into my heart? What do you mean that I don't have the right to marry someone else simply because I divorced this person because I didn't like them anymore? What do you mean I can't do that? That doesn't seem reasonable at all. What do you mean every church doesn't do the right things? I mean, if I'm happy and satisfied with it, doesn't that mean it's okay? You see my point? There's going to be times when people are going to look to you with these kind of questions, and you must be a good leader. And instead of pointing them to what seems reasonable in human wisdom, you just point them to what the will of God is. And you trust in that. There's going to be a time when good leaders are going to have to bring people together in unity of purpose. That's what good leaders do when it comes to the local church. There's always going to be someone who needs a job to better help them develop and grow spiritually. Sometimes someone just needs to be put to work. And in putting them to work, though sometimes you may look at them and see their development is so slow, and they may make mistakes along the way, but you're long-suffering and patient as God was with Moses, as Moses was with Israel. And you let those people develop and allow them to do a work that will help them become more effective and more efficient, that the Lord's church can be what it needs to be. Good leadership does that. And at the same time, good leadership is level-headed when it comes to making decisions in difficult times. Let's just look at 2020 itself. I mean, think about being a leader in 2020. Think about being an elder of the Lord's church in 2020 and 2021. I mean, I look at leaders elsewhere, and they're running like to and fro all over the place, just like fiery serpents were in their midst, and the leaders are running with them. And where do people have to look to for security? Where do people have to look to for comfort? Where do people get to look to find the will of God and say, stand still and see the salvation of the Lord? Good leaders do that in times of chaos and difficulty when the rest of the world is following every conspiracy theory known to man. Leaders aren't doing that. They're telling people, you keep looking to God and His will. You stand right here. We must do that, just as Moses did. We must make those difficult decisions just as Moses did. We must come together in unity of purpose. We must have faith and absolute trust in God. Good leaders will always have these characteristics. But secondly, this is very important to understand as well. Though good leadership has great attributes of character, pride always destroys good leadership. Always. And it was no different with Moses, was it? Pride always follows something good, doesn't it? You know, I have never known someone to be absolutely as arrogant as they could ever be after they've been an utter failure. Have you? I haven't. I've never seen anyone just fail at everything that they tried to do over a course of time and walk away from that and just be the most arrogant person in the world. But I've seen plenty of people, and I know I've been in this position myself, that when I've had successes and accomplishments, that's when I can be the most arrogant that I've ever been. Pride always follows that. And like I said, it's no different when it came to Moses. I won't ask you to turn back to 16 and 17 of Numbers, but you remember, and the young people ought to have this fresh on their mind, our younger classes have just studied this. In the rebellion of Korah, Dathan, and Abiram, when they challenged the leadership of Moses and Aaron, and God replied. When those men wanted Moses and Aaron to get out of the way and they wanted to be in the leadership of the people, God spoke in a powerful way. He opened up the earth and He swallowed all of those men and their families up. And he caused Aaron's rod to bud among the people to show that these are my men. These are my leaders. After you get 17 delivered, you have 18, 19, giving some instruction for the people in regard to this time. But then it comes back to the narrative in chapter 20. And what we see is that soon after God validated their leadership, Moses is overtaken by pride. It happened to him just like it happens to everybody else. Look at chapter 20 of the book of Numbers and begin with me there. We'll begin reading in verse 7, but let me just lead you up to the point. The children of Israel have came to the wilderness of Zin. They're here in a place called Kadesh. And here again, you have the people with the same murmur, the same complaint. Why have you brought us out here to die? Well, all Moses and Aaron know to do is to go to God. And they go to God and they bow before God at the tabernacle of meeting, and the Lord appeared to them. Verse 7. Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, take the rod, you and your brother Aaron, gather the congregation together. Speak to the rock before their eyes, and it will yield its water. Thus you shall bring water for them out of the rock, and give drink to the congregation and their animals. So Moses took the rod from before the Lord as he commanded him. Now, let's put yourself in Moses' place. Let me put myself in Moses' place. God has powerfully validated me as the leader. Me and my brother Aaron, we're God's chosen men. And now the congregation is complaining about you again? So they go to God and God says, here, you tell them to do this. Can't you see Moses looking at Aaron? Yeah. Who these people think they are? I tell you what, I'll show them who we are. Talk to us that way as God's chosen leaders. I'm Moses and you're Aaron. Can't they tell who we are? We're God's men. I can almost see that discussion taking place as they walk back to the people. Then verse 10. And Moses and Aaron gathered the assembly together before the rock, and he said to them, hear now, you rebels, must we bring water for you out of this rock? Then Moses lifted his hand and struck the rock twice with his rod, and water came out abundantly, and the congregation and their animals drank. Then the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, because you did not believe me to hallow me in the eyes of the children of Israel, therefore you shall not bring this assembly into the land which I have given them. And he goes on to tell about what that place was called. Moses gets there and he paid no attention at all to what God said. God didn't tell him to strike the rock as he had in the past. He told him to speak to the rock. But Moses was so overcome with arrogance, it seems, because of the disrespect the people gave him, that pride caused him to say, do you want us to bring water from this rock for you? Well, watch how I'm going to do it. And he struck the rock. God didn't punish Israel for that. But he punished Moses and Aaron, didn't he? What caused Moses to disobey God and to make it seem as though he was the one bringing the water to Israel? What caused him to do that? There's no doubt it was pride. Pride had overtaken him in that moment. Leadership had been established. Moses wanted that to be known in a big way just so they could see him. Now, I may be making some assumption, but I believe it's valid. In the same way with you and I, once leadership is established, we must beware of pride. We've got to. Satan loves the proud look. Proverbs 6 and verse 16 says that God hates it. But Satan loves it. And we need to think about this in a very practical way. The good church at Gardendale. How much success and accomplishment has the good church at Gardendale seen recently? I'm not trying to brag on us to exalt us in any way. I think we need to be careful of that. But you look at a church like the Gardendale Church, and I turn and look at it all the time, and it blows me away. To see spiritually minded people, so many spiritually minded people who have unity of purpose and want to work in the kingdom of the Lord. We see people studying the Bible and obeying the gospel. We see ongoing studies all the time. People ask me about the Gardendale Church all the time. What is it about the Gardendale Church? I said, well, you just can't believe it. And we have great leaders from elders to deacons, and I believe your preachers try their best to do a good job. I'm not trying to exalt myself and Andrew, but I tell you what, we dedicate ourselves to work hard. But at the end of the day, when you've got so much good and so much success and so much achievement, we better not going around thinking that we're the lead of the local church in the world either. When somebody starts talking about the local church, well, you ought to look at Gardendale. And I'm a part of Gardendale, and you need to be more like Gardendale. Because we are just the cream of the crop. We're it, and we can't do anything wrong. You just need to come, and you just need to videotape us, and you follow that pattern. Satan loves that. You bet he does. He loves that. When what we ought to be doing is say, yes, we've had a lot of success. We have a lot of achievement that we have seen. We have great leaders. We have great brethren. But at the same time, give God all the glory. Because He's the one that's made it possible. Paul said, I planted, Apollos watered, but who gave the increase? God did. To God be the glory. And let that always be in our minds so that we can come to that understanding. If it was the case for the apostles, it must be the case for us too. Paul was given a thorn in his flesh for that very reason. Do you remember that in 2 Corinthians chapter 12? He said himself, in regard to the revelations that he had been given, he had seen things that no man had seen before. He had very lofty things that had been given to him that nobody else had seen. Could that puff a man up? You think that can make a man prideful? God understood that it could. And Paul said himself, unless that I should be exalted above measure by the abundance of the revelations, a thorn in the flesh was given to me, a messenger of Satan to buffet me, lest I be exalted above measure. The exalted above measure was him becoming too prideful, because God knew that if Paul became too prideful in regard to his accomplishments and achievements, if you will, then it would affect his leadership in a very poor way. Why? Because in every case, no matter what generation or time you live in, pride always destroys good leadership. And we must be mindful of that and beware of it. But with that in mind, finally, let's talk about this. Not only does good leadership have these great attributes of character that are always there when leadership is at its best. Not only does good leadership always mindful of pride and being aware of that, but it also rears other good leaders. Good leadership rears good leadership. That's a biblical thought that's all the way through the Scriptures. My point is that good leaders develop other leaders. There's no doubt we see that in the life of Moses. If you'll go back with me to the book of Exodus, this time to chapter 17. Exodus chapter 17. They're journeying on their way, and now Amalek comes to fight against Israel. This is the first time we're introduced to a man named Joshua. And he just appears here. No other mention before this time, I believe. I haven't found it. But Joshua appears here, and I think for a very important reason. Read with me, beginning here in chapter 17 and verse 8. Now Amalek came and fought with Israel in Rephidim. And Moses said to Joshua, choose us some men and go out, fight with Amalek. Tomorrow I will stand on top of the hill with the rod of God in my hand. So Joshua did as Moses said to him and fought with Amalek. And Moses, Aaron, and Hur went to the top of the hill. And so it was when Moses held up his hand that Israel prevailed. And when he let down his hand, Amalek prevailed. But Moses' hands became heavy so that they took a stone and put it under him, and he sat on it. And Aaron and Hur supported his hands, one on one side and one on the other side. And his hands were steady until the going down of the sun. So Joshua defeated Amalek and his people with the edge of the sword. Who defeated Amalek? Israel did. But who was attributed to the leadership? It was Joshua. Here we see Joshua comes upon the scene now, and God is showing us that Joshua's being groomed for leadership. Not only is he being groomed for it, he's in a position now of the commander of the army. Joshua is a leader. But there's something else said in verse 14 that's very significant. Then the Lord said to Moses, write this for a memorial in the book and recount it in the hearing of Joshua, that I will utterly blot out the remembrance of Amalek from under heaven. Let's just stop right there. This victory that Israel accomplishes that day with Joshua's leadership, God tells Moses, you write it in the book. You preserve this because I want it to be read in the hearing of Joshua. When? Well, it had to be on down the road when Joshua was going to become the leader of Israel. But what's God pointing to now? That Joshua is being groomed for that role. Moses now has taken Joshua and moved him in a position. Obviously, God had seen and Moses had seen that Joshua had abilities and capability to lead. And he's being moved in a position and being reared to become the leader that he needs to be. And he wants Joshua to be reminded of this occasion, of how the Lord was with him on this day, because that's going to build up and support his leadership in the future. Notice furthermore that from this time on, we find Joshua shadowing Moses' leadership. Chapter 24. Moses is going up to the mountain of God to receive the law. Moses goes up, the elders of Israel go up to a certain point, but they can't go any farther. But Moses can. But there's someone he takes along with him, and that's Joshua. Look at verse 13 of chapter 24. So Moses arose with his assistant Joshua, and Moses went up to the mountain of God and said to the elders, wait here for us until we come back to you. Indeed, Aaron and Hur are with you. If any man has difficulty, let him go to them. Then Moses went up into the mountain, and a cloud covered the mountain. There was no one at that time any closer to God than Moses. Wouldn't you agree? But can I say this? There was no one any closer to Moses than Joshua. And if Moses was as close to God as any man could be, how close does that put Joshua? Right there with him. You want to tell me that Joshua isn't being reared to become a leader? He's with Moses step by step by step by step. And who's doing that? God's doing that. God is showing us that good leaders must be formed and shaped. They need to observe other good leadership. Now, I'm not saying that Joshua didn't have a desire. I know he did. But if that man has a desire, he has capabilities and qualities that exhibit good leadership, he's being formed and reared to be a good leader. And did not such qualify him to be just that? Go over with me now to Deuteronomy chapter 34. Chapter 34. Let's begin reading in verse 5. Deuteronomy 34, beginning in verse 5. It says here, so Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in the land of Moab, according to the word of the Lord. And he buried him in a valley in the land of Moab, opposite Beth Peor. But no one knows his grave to this day. Moses was 120 years old when he died. His eyes were not dim, nor his natural vigor diminished. And the children of Israel wept before Moses in the plains of Moab 30 days. So the days of weeping and mourning for Moses ended. Now Joshua the son of Nun was full of the Spirit and wisdom, for Moses had laid his hands on him. So the children of Israel had heeded him, and did as the Lord commanded Moses. It validates it, doesn't it? We've seen the process all the way from a very early time with the children of Israel. Joshua was brought onto the scene. Joshua was moved into a position of leadership. Joshua is groomed in a position of leadership, and eventually Joshua moves into that position of leadership. Why? Because he's been developed as a leader. It was God's will and God's intention that it be done so. Just read Joshua chapter 1 sometime. I won't take the time this morning to read it. But it validates everything we just said. God says to Joshua, Moses, my servant, is now dead. Now you stand in his place. I'm validating you as the leader of the people. You do as Moses did, and I will be with you. Can't you see? It's a blessing when good leaders develop other good leaders, because you have another leader who's just as strong and steadfast and confident in his faith in God as the last one was. We need that. The church needs that. And we have to do the same when it comes to good leadership. 3 New Testament passages and the lesson will be yours. 2 Timothy chapter 2. I want you to see how this same concept is brought from the Old Testament to the New. Paul writing to Timothy in 2 Timothy chapter 2. Look with me now, beginning in verse 1 of chapter 2. Paul writes, You therefore, my son, be strong in the grace that is in Christ Jesus, and the things you have heard from me among many witnesses, commit these to faithful men who will be able to teach others also. Paul had taught Timothy things. Paul had taught Timothy how to be a leader among God's people. And now he tells Timothy, the things that I've taught you, you teach these things to faithful men so that they can teach others and be leaders just like you are. Men need to be preparing men to lead. The Bible says so. That's something that we need to be dedicated about doing. Look over to the book of Titus, chapter 2. Ladies, it's no different for you. Titus chapter 2, beginning in verse 3. Giving instruction to different people, he begins here with the older women. The older women likewise, that they be reverent in behavior, not slanderers, not given to much wine, teachers of good things, that they admonish the young women to love their husbands, love their children, to be discreet, chaste, homemakers, good, obedient to their own husbands, that the word of God may not be blasphemed. What do ladies need to be doing? They need to be teaching other women to be leaders in the role that they've been given. They need to step out and teach them there's a position that you have. There's going to be times in your realm that you're called on to be a leader. But you need to be taught to stand up and lead in that position. There are times when strong brethren need to prepare weak brethren. I remember Andrew's good sermon about Brother Cicero not too long ago, and he used the example of Barnabas and John Mark. You remember in Acts 15 when Paul didn't want him to go because he had abandoned them. Barnabas said, I'm going to take him. And he did take him. And he took that young man who had been weak in his life but still had shown qualities and attributes of leadership. Barnabas wanted to look upon that man and see that and develop that man into a leader. And he took him and he did it. Did it work? 2 Timothy chapter 4. Even Paul himself recognizes something about this. Look at verse 11. Before his death, as he's asking people to come to him, he says, only Luke is with me. Verse 11, get Mark and bring him with you, for he is useful for me for the ministry. Was he effective as a leader? Yes. Why? Because Barnabas took him and he groomed him and he prepared him and he reared him and he caused those attributes of leadership that were there within him to grow even more, and he became more effective and more efficient. And even Paul could use him at that time. In the same way, we have to do that as well. Good leaders must develop good leaders in every area. Let me tell you why that's so important. Let's just look at it this way. Let's say there's a situation where some young people are together somewhere out in the community. And someone approaches them, maybe it's an acquaintance of them from school or whatever, and someone approaches them and they encourage them to do something sinful. Hey guys, I've got a case of beer. Let's go out here on the back road and let's have some fun. And they all start looking at one another. And one young man among the group, or a young lady among the group, stands up and says, no, that's not what God desires of us as His people. God wants us to be sober-minded and to keep ourselves from sin. We're going to go away from here and do something else. What has happened in that moment? Good leadership has been exhibited. Let's just think about it when it comes to maybe a group of Christian ladies that are together. and they're discussing the work of the church. And someone speaks up and says, well, I just think it's not fair because women can't get up and teach in the assembly. That's just not right. I just tell you what, that's just bigotry. And one of the Christian ladies stands up in the group and says, well, this is what God's will is on the matter. And God has given us a very special role that we feel, and it's an important role. And there's many other things that we can do in the service of the Lord that make the work of the Lord effective. And if this is God's will, this is the best thing for us. What's happened in that moment? Good leadership has been exhibited. What about in the home one day? When a mother and father are talking to their daughter, and she's wanting to wear clothing of the world. Maybe she's wanting to wear these shorty shorts that all the rest of the world is wearing. These little short running shorts. All her friends are wearing around. And the mother and father look at her and talk to her about biblical modesty and the importance of that. And they look at her and they tell her that the most important beauty is the innermost beauty of the heart. That's what God loves, and it never grows old. What's happened in that moment? Good leadership has been exhibited, hasn't it? I understand that the elders of the church bear the load of responsibility when it comes to leadership. And it's a very challenging role. But at times, brethren, all of us are going to be in a position that we must rise up and lead. May we exhibit the same attributes of leadership that Moses did. And let our leadership always be good leadership that we can rear good leaders for the future. That's your sermon this morning. I hope it's been beneficial to you. It has been for me as to go through it. If you're here this morning and you're not a Christian, we do want to encourage you to become one. If you have those thoughts on your mind, please let us talk to you about those things. We want to encourage you to become a child of God through obedience to the gospel. If you're here this morning and you have questions about your service to the Lord, if you're just become weak, if you need the prayers of the saints, whatever it may be, please come that we can help you as we stand and we sing this song.